In the last video, I had mentioned that as soon as we start using require statements, we might see errors like this, and it gets a little bit challenging to figure out why our functions are failing, specifically because the error message does not say that we failed some require check. Now, fortunately, there is a good way inside of Remix in particular to make debugging of your function calls a little bit more clear. When we made this function call to the enter function, we saw in the console this little transaction log appear. And then next to it are two buttons. If you click the details button, you'll see some information about the transaction that was sent. And then right next to that, you'll see a debug button. So as you might guess, yes, this debug tool right here is what's going to make it a lot easier to figure out why our function calls fail. So we can click on debug, and then you'll see the right-hand panel change into something that looks like this right here. This is a fantastic tool that I really expect you are going to use quite a bit as you start writing your own contracts. This debugger allows you to step through the execution of your code expression by expression and get a better sense of how data is flowing around your contract. The big thing I want to draw your attention to is this slidey bar right here. The slidey bar allows us to fast forward or rewind along the execution of our contract. So if you drag it all the way back to the left-hand side, you start with the entire contract highlighted like so. You can then click this step in arrow right here, and it will start stepping you through the execution of the contract. So I can click step into. This makes it clear that, okay, we're about to run the enter function. So notice how this gets highlighted. Also notice how down here in these drop downs, you can get some information about the current state of our contract. So we can see the exact address of the manager variable, and we can also see that it looks like the players array has one entry inside of it right now. We can click the step into again, and then it starts to highlight each individual expression that is being evaluated by the Solidity compiler. Now in this case, of course, there's probably nothing wrong with 0.01 ether. It then looks at the value of message.value, and then it tries to compute the entire line altogether. And you'll notice that our little draggy right here is now at the very end, and we cannot step any further. So as you might guess, this right here was the end of our function call, and thus it makes it a lot more obvious to you, the developer, where the function call went wrong. So when you start seeing an error message like this down here, so something that just says, hey, error occurred, I really recommend you start to use this debugger right here, and it will give you a much better idea of not only where your function failed, but also what the values of some variables were as that function was running. On a very related note, besides the debugger, you might be curious if there is any type of console log functionality with Solidity. There is technically, but it's very limited in scope and a little bit more challenging to use. So if you are someone who is used to using console logs to develop and debug your code, well, unfortunately, that strategy doesn't work out quite so well when we start working with contracts. Instead, this debugger that you see right here is really the go-to solution, and this is really what I expect you are going to use personally as soon as you start working on your own contracts. Now, as time goes on, we're going to continue to use the debugger quite a bit, but in general, I'm going to kind of leave it to you to figure out how some of it works and how to interact with it. Because obviously, being in a course, I could introduce errors to our code and then say like, hey, let's use the debugger to fix this. But anytime I purposely put errors in the code, sometimes it gets a little bit misleading why things are breaking. Okay, so now that we've got a better idea of how this debugger works, let's pause here and continue working on our contract in the next video.